called me yet to come solve those problems, so you're stuck with me for this. And perhaps this is a more noble calling and a more noble cause, because the destruction and the devastation that you see impacts lives in unimaginable ways. And my experience in New Orleans really, post-Katrina, changed my life. And so we're here to talk about how to live safely with water. 70% of the world's population live within 100 miles of the ocean. This is a growing problem. There are more people and more assets at risk, and so we have an important job to do. In the US, I think the statistic is 80% of the people will live within 50 miles of the coast at some point in the next 20 or 30 years. So this is a growth industry for us. And so we have a noble challenge and a noble cause, and if you do this right, we'll have a big impact. And the Dutch struggle with water. They have struggled with water for 800 years. Their democracy was formed, grounded in the foundation and the institution of water boards, in which the people gathered their resources and gathered their property together so that they could fight the water wolf and reclaim their land and develop their property and grow their economy and live safely in that dangerous environment. And they offer a lot of examples for the rest of the world. Looking at these technical design solutions, where do we go? The master of adaptation in the bayous of Louisiana is a gentleman called Wendell Curell. He's a Cajun, has that funny accent, and he says, and I can't do the accent, he says, elevation is the salvation from inundation. And that's true. We shouldn't live in dangerous places unless we're prepared to adapt to it. So we need to understand where we're living in these FEMA flood risk maps and all the great resources that the APA and the local governments have. We need to respect that and understand that. And convey to people that if they're living in dangerous areas, that they need to prepare for that and understand that. Build above the flood level where and when you can. Building codes are crucial, and we will hear more about that. They are crucial in the Netherlands, they are crucial in Florida, they are crucial here in the Rockaways, in Sandy Hook, all the neighborhoods are crucial. But they have to be specific to the landscape. The National Building Code or a code that's for everyone probably doesn't work well. So you have to make sure that's right. When you retrofit buildings, when you build in new areas, you have to respect and build in flexibility to sea level rise and the changing weather patterns. It's very important. You have to harden critical infrastructure. The things that happened here in lower Manhattan shocked a lot of people, but I think people knew this would happen if a storm surge of that magnitude would come in here. And this is hardening the electrical grid and hardening the telecom systems. We all love our Blackberries, and Wall Street depends upon information. Hospitals, fuel supply, subways, all these pieces of local infrastructure need to be hardened. You need to think of a Dutch concept that's called retain, store, and drain. So it's retain water where it falls, store it where possible, and drain it only when necessary. Paul talked about this, but this creates new opportunities for urban design, and it reduces flood risk. And a lot of people, as we said, like to live near the water. So if you design right, you can create value and safety together. We are involved with the Dutch-American team in New Orleans, grew out of something called the Dutch Dialogues. That's one of my babies, so to speak, and we put together a cross-cultural, multi-discipline team of experts that worked freely with a goal in mind, and they created some new ideas, and a HUD-funded project is now underway to make that city safer from water and more economically valuable and more a nicer place to live. And these kinds of activities, not just engineers and not just planners separately, but together, these are the kind of things that people need to do. The Netherlands has something called a water plan. Every community, every province, every city, they have to develop a water plan so that you understand what the water is going to do in that environment. And the Water Board, which is a very powerful institution, has the right to assess whether that's appropriate and useful and robust enough. And these kinds of things are important. You can look at things like delta plans. The Dutch have been called into Bangkok into Vietnam, into China, and Indonesia, to look at the operating of the entire water system in a delta and how those things should move forward. The kind of approach that the Dutch have to occupy the dangerous landscape where they live, because they don't want to move to Germany. And you have to look at hard and soft infrastructure. Kate presented that just perfectly. The Dutch are all about this. It's not only hard infrastructure, the gray infrastructure, it's the green and soft infrastructure. And there are so many things you can do. Of course, in the Netherlands, you need levees, and of course, in New Orleans, you need levees, and along the Mississippi and the Sacramento rivers, you need levees. And you need pump systems and pump stations. But when you design these things, we know climate change is happening. We know we need to prepare for sea level rise, so build flexibility into these systems as you go forward. And you can think of, in urban areas where you have multifunctional dikes and levees, building a levee or a dike or a seawall along the Manhattan seafront may be controversial, but you can do this in a way where there's mixed use and parking and retail and all these other things built into that structure. They're doing this in the Netherlands, and Jos is going to talk about that. They're doing this in a town called Vlissingen, which is the old Flushing, I guess. And you can do these things, and as my friend Wendell said, these levees aren't your normal piece of river dirt. So these can be multifunctional. Build green infrastructure. The Dutch have a research program called Building with Nature, and they're looking at something called the sand motor, which is a different way of distributing sand along the Dutch coast. Oyster reefs. Oysters are wonderful. Oyster reefs are wonderful because they trap sediment, they accrete, they mitigate surge, they mitigate wave action, they clean the water. These are good things to do, and the Dutch are looking to implement more and more of these things in their own delta. Biosealing, where you use biological agents to harden structures in a natural way. Wetlands. Kate showed this. These are tricky things because for storm surge mitigation, you need approximately 1 mile of wetland to dampen 1 foot of storm surge. So it's an additive benefit. It's not the total solution. And finally, I'm going to wrap up with this. We at the embassy have been amazed by all the attention given to the Dutch since Sandy and the discussion about barriers. The Dutch, are known for this. They're the barrier boys. And in fact, we have nothing to do with that press. We are not promoting these things for New York and New Jersey. We love the attention, so to speak, but barriers are controversial. Barriers have a role in the Netherlands for the Dutch. They are happy with their barriers, provides a tremendous amount of protection for them. They can resist a 1 in 10,000 year storm along the Dutch coast in a lot of ways. So these are very relevant for the Netherlands, and they're used in St. Petersburg and in Venice and other places around the world. But they're expensive to build, and they're expensive to maintain. You're buying a Ferrari, and it's got to go to the shop every now and then, and your estimate is about 0.5% per year of maintenance cost of the total cost of the project. So these are expensive. So if you go this route, understand what you're getting into. The cost-benefit analysis done for most barriers are very positive. The costs are always much less than the benefits. But that's your decision, and that's for the Dutch to say. And then finally, as I've showed you here, the Dutch use a multi-layered approach. Paul said this, it is not one thing stopping the water or one adaptation in the environment or the built environment. It's a number of different things. And I'll sum up with this. The Dutch have a saying in Dutch, and I'll translate, it is not either or, but it's and this and that. And I think that's what we're about today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. As a New Yorker, it was comforting and strengthening to see that within hours, or probably even minutes, even as the waters were receding, how many different people, agencies of all different levels of government, private sector involvement, and then just individuals showed up to help and try to get the region recovering literally instantly. And how all of those different groups interacted even when they weren't coordinated. Just as inspiring was how quickly ordinary New Yorkers started talking about how you re-envision a city and how we have to change some fundamental things about how we live in this city. And it wasn't just technocrats and experts who started talking about this, but I heard this kind of conversation coming from all kinds of people who have no direct knowledge, but understood instinctively that this anomaly was something that we may have to get used to, but in any case that we need to deal with. So I want to thank everybody for all of these different perspectives. And I wanted to ask, start by asking Kate whether, Sandy was a deeply shocking event, and many of the components of it were shocking. Kate, when you look at the edges of New York, and especially some of the work that was done recently along the waterfront and the whole, the waterfront parks and the embrace of the waterfront that we've been going through as a city in the last 20 years, were there any good surprises? Were there any things that worked at least as well as landscape architects expected, and maybe even better?
Well, I would say one thing from a building perspective, if you take the scenario of Red Hook, which was the area that we were focused on, and I think the new construction, I mean, for example, at IKEA, where there was parking at the lower level and the retail at the above level, fared much better than, say, the next door shop at Fairway. And so I think that was just an example of a new construction that is successful, right? And then that it was able to exist in its context. But the rest of Red Hook, all of the sort of community-based gardens, everything that everyone was doing right to try to live within their sort of carbon footprint, all of that was really destroyed. So, and the Red Hook and Gowanus areas were quite vulnerable, in fact. And things that I've been studying in some of our Columbia studios were looking not only at Holland, but at other countries around the world that have remade their waterfronts with, in Israel and in Japan, with a sort of an infrastructure that may include kind of tetrapods or ways of really building up the shorelines, but that integrate sort of inhabitability and integrate kind of habitat creation. So those are the examples that I've been really interested in following. I think there are many other examples of waterfront parks like Brooklyn Bridge Park that fared quite well in the storm, and many of the leadership at city planning and leadership with Parks Department has been coming through, I think, with a lot of the new construction.
So I guess this gets to Jeannie's question about whether we have the tools and now we just need to use them. Jeannie, you were talking primarily about the organizational tools and coordinating all the different wisdom that we've accumulated. I guess my question is, if you take, say, some of the successes of the building codes, the newer building codes, in some areas that fared relatively well, some of the parks that were designed with this kind of event or something like it in mind, like Brooklyn Bridge Park, and you combine those things, is it just a matter of scaling those things up and retrofitting all of the edge of the city that doesn't work that way? Can we sort of apply those lessons broadly?
Well, I'd like to observe that we haven't been doing that. We have these tools, but if you go back and look at them, if you look at, for example, the recent text amendments for the waterfront zoning, it's all hardscape. We have not done anything original in our legislation that takes into account the fact that we need to have perhaps green factor zoning, so that we give incentives and credits, as they do in other cities, for these kinds of things. If you look at the hazard mitigation plan that we had to do in order to get funding from FEMA, we didn't do it because we wanted to, we had to, and this is how we do our planning oftentimes in New York. There was 306 suggestions for mitigation, 145 we're supposedly doing, but there's no monitoring that I could see, and another 161 that we ought to be doing. So we can go back and look at all of these things that we have with this new view of how we retrofit our structural, administrative information and plans and policies that we have in place. We have them in place, but we need to just slice through them and say, okay, what do we need to really make these things work? And the other thing we need is we need comprehensive maps of our infrastructure. I was talking to Alex Garvin a couple of days ago, and he was, of course, working in Lower Manhattan. He said there's no map for Lower Manhattan. Maybe it's changed, but no map for Lower Manhattan that pulls together in one place all of the infrastructure that will be affected in a resilience event. And, you know, where are we? We've got silos. We've got Port Authority with its information, Con Ed with its information, City Planning with its information, Corps of Engineers with information. It's all up there, but no one's pulling it together. And that's what we need, the leadership to do that, so that we can make this vision that I don't think is rocket science. We can create this vision and get it done if we have that leadership.
My guess is there's probably a 16-year-old in Russia who has actually made this map, but we just have to find who the person is. So if we look at some of the more recent waterfront development, as we've transitioned from into a post-industrial waterfront, let me ask the other side of that as to whether there were good surprises. Were there any things that failed spectacularly? And I'm not talking about, you know, the old industrial waterfront that hasn't been sufficiently upgraded, but really the newish construction of the last 20 years. Should we be looking at any of those and saying, how could we have done this so recently when we knew this was a problem? Anybody want to take that one?
My answer is yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to point to specific failures, but I would just also put the challenge out there that what I would like to put forward is it's not just about the waterfront, the edges of the current existing city, but that there's another way of thinking that has to do with water itself and the sort of harbor scale working out and in the water. Because I think some of the maps that I showed is that there's this kind of sensibility of encroachment, and that if we just kind of build more and more and farther out, that somehow we'll solve the problem at the edges. So I think that also needs a little bit of a paradigm shift in terms of thinking about what the front is. It's not just the edge between water and land, it's somehow working out and in the water itself.
I'd like to second that idea. If you look at the visuals in the waterfront plan, for example, and I have that in my first slide, the waterfront as defined, that 500 miles plus, it's a little thin strip, right? We need to do what our friends here were saying, think about where water goes. It's throughout the whole city. We have privately owned public spaces that we could take and make them sponges. We have large parks that become sponges. There are lots of things we need to do and must do in this new way of looking at things.
If I could add one thing there, I don't want to pick up a specific building, but emergency generators, for example, and their placement and the way they're operated. In Houston, about 15 years ago, they had huge floods that affected the Texas Medical Center. Lots of sort of incredibly smart people who worked there, lots of new buildings. Most of the emergency generators were on concrete pads at ground level. So the first thing that happened when they had their flood was there went their emergency generators almost before they lost their main source of power. Here, there are stories of some of those being located so high up that you had human chains carrying fuel, because guess what? They require fuel if they're going to help out in a situation. So I think there are a number of those kind of things where we do need to reassess and sort of stop being stupid in some of the things we do, because there are too many examples. That's just one I've given you.
So we've talked about taking sort of the hard infrastructure approach and the soft edges approach and the sort of the oyster texture and integrating them. It seemed to me almost immediately in the wake of Sandy that those two things, at least in the minds of New Yorkers, hardened into two really different philosophies. One was the really large capital investment that was either going to work or not, and that was really going to protect the city. And the other was kind of what seemed to some people like a kind of hippy-dippy living with nature approach of maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but look, in the face of a real onslaught, this is all just, kidding around. So how policymakers find a way to show that these things are actually not mutually exclusive?
There are some examples in the Netherlands that are relevant, and actually, if I could plug the website livingwithwater.com, that's for the project in New Orleans. The Dutch and Americans are working together. There are these interventions in there. single in Rotterdam that is an urban linear park along an old historic canal. It was redesigned, there's sculptures on it, has a linear feature to it that when the water level in Rotterdam gets high because of rain, that park floods. They are designing new skate parks. This is a dense urban area, dense urban city. They're designing skate parks where stormwater from the nearby roofs are going to flow into that skate park, and it'll hold the water for 2 hours or 4 hours and drain it away. There is a new parking garage built next to the Netherlands Architects Institute. Needed parking space. 1/4 of that garage is designed to fill up with stormwater from all the buildings around nearby. It self-cleans itself whenever the water is released. There are these kinds of interventions. And then finally, in areas in Rotterdam between the dikes, so in a Dutch context, that means outside the protection system. They are these old harbor neighborhoods and industrial sites that are being renovated because Rotterdam was at risk of losing its urban identity, its urban core, because of the shipping industry moved closer to the sea. They are renovating these islands, elevating the homes, mixed use is going in there, and the property values are skyrocketing because people want to live there, even though they're not protected. So if you communicate to people where they're living, and if you make them sure that make sure that they understand their risk, and you design well, you can do this. There are projects throughout the Netherlands that are combining these functions of living near the water because it's wonderful and beautiful and risky, and communicating those kind of risks to the citizens.
It's interesting that you mentioned rising property values in those areas, because that brings me to another question I was going to ask. I was struck in Amsterdam recently at seeing how much of the housing is in the northern part of the city towards the water, and that's really where the city is expanding. When we look at New York, and Kate mentioned this earlier, if you take a sort of cold economic approach and say we have to invest the most, whether it's in hard infrastructure or other kinds, in the areas where the greatest density and assets are, they're mostly in the densest parts of New York, in Manhattan, Lower Manhattan. Does that mean a kind of un-American trade-off of saying, well, you know what, if we're going to build a barrier there, that means leaving those people outside it, and maybe, unlike on other parts of the coast, we're not going to encourage rebuilding in places that were the hardest hit and where presumably, although we don't know this, property values have actually been negatively impacted, I would think. Is there a lesson that we actually have to take unequal approaches to different parts of the region?
I think global warming and the surges have exposed tremendous inequity in the system, but I think it's our task, our collective task, to address that. And I would also say, like, for example, in that sketch, that was this hybrid sketch, was this notion of kind of protecting the sort of harbor with sort of hard infrastructure, but also replenishing dunes and trying to extend this longer, more filigreed line, which is this hybrid of hard and soft, all along the sort of coast of New Jersey and New York. And as was mentioned earlier, I think waterfront communities were differentially impacted. Long Beach was really devastated. They did not have a dune. But I think if we can begin to imagine a sort of, everyone's talking about vision and planning, and I think that as in the same way that we're trying to expose the false dichotomy between hard and soft infrastructure, I think we have to expose the false dichotomy between big and small, because I think what is shown is that these sort of incremental habitat and sort of ecological infrastructures can have quite a big impact in their agglomerative effect, but that, for example, a big kind of theoretically big line in the water of sort of a seawall might actually be overspilled and have a small effect. So I think it's quite interesting to think about this hybrid effect and protecting the entire edge with the right thinking and the right values.
I would also say that I think we need to take a hard look at our incentives. If you look at that natural hazards mitigation plan, you'll see maps about insurance, federal insurance, flood insurance, where there have been repeated incidents and so forth. We've got to decide who's going to pay for what and what we want to value. And we really, really need to decide whether and why we make investments in certain areas with regard to what it's going to cost society as a whole and our nation as a whole in terms of what we're going to support.
So to put it as bluntly as possible, do we need to simply shrink or write off certain neighborhoods as places that either can't be protected, can't really be mitigated, or really aren't worth mitigating or protecting? Is that a reasonable way to think about the whole picture, as cruel as it sounds?
Yes, we do. And the question is what level of protection. If we can build sand dunes and protect individual private houses and we're willing to pay for that, fine. If we're not, then we shouldn't. We should be compensating those folks who have had their property there and helping them relocate or whatever. But these are societal costs, and we haven't recognized them as societal costs.
Dale, do you have a thought about that?
So the unwritten rule of diplomacy is one government does not comment on another government's. So I'll just defer there. I would say in the Netherlands, they have made some choices in the past where they are going to not protect as robustly as before some areas, and they are moving people out of areas with support, with a subsidy, to move them out of areas to mitigate their own risk and to mitigate the risk of upstream and downstream communities. So they are making those choices. Whether that's relevant and an example for the U.S. is not for us to say.
There's this word buyout that you're kind of implying too, which I think that has been the case in Holland, where farmers have incentivized and bought out certain, to enable their land to serve ecological function. And I think that is a great question before us. I think the question in my mind is that, are we inhabiting our barrier dunes? and is that feasible long term? And to me, I think that is something that we need to think very deeply about.
Paul, I wanted to ask you, because you've seen so many different kinds of situations, and I think we tend to get narrowly focused on ours. Is there, two related questions. One is, can you point us to some unintended consequences that may come from changes of thinking to combat Sandy and a Sandy-like future? And are we thinking too narrowly about climate change, especially if it has many different effects? Are we, by focusing on floods and storm surge, attacking the most immediate and important problem, but maybe forgetting about or temporarily ignoring other things that could flow out of the same set of situations? I mean, one of the things that really struck me was the images of water flooding into the World Trade Center site and flooding specifically the museum where they wanted to store artifacts that had been destroyed in the event that we have been so focused on protecting about that we forgot about that. So are we setting ourselves up in some way for the next round of misdirected protection?
I mean, I think that's a very good question. The country has almost forgotten about the drought that Donovan mentioned that was the worst since the Dust Bowl, and that was only a few months ago. And then Sandy hits. I think that the assessment of kind of multiple threats is absolutely critical, so that we understand that we're not just trying to solve the rare event that just happened that we weren't expecting and we weren't prepared for, but what is the next one? Even in terms of a hurricane, Sandy was not much of a rain event, for example. One of the things that hit New Orleans in Katrina was an enormous rain event. It wasn't the wind, for example, in New Orleans. New Orleans also relates to the issue of unexpected consequences. Without a doubt, the consequence of protecting communities for decades along the Mississippi has starved the Delta from its natural food, and that made the event in New Orleans worse. So on that very large scale, we certainly had unexpected consequences there. So we absolutely do need to look at the multiple events we need to plan for. We need to look at probabilities, we need to look at the severity of events, and then kind of one by one start dealing with the practical issues of how much do you elevate?
So
where should you not allow building to occur?
So is there an analogy here to that, to that, what you were alluding to in New Orleans or along the Mississippi, where if we focus on the large-scale investments of protecting through floodgates, that we actually undo some of the green aspects. Do we affect the ecology of the harbor in ways that we're not really prepared to deal with it, and they've been dealing with this in the Netherlands?
Sure. So a couple things that are at play here. The Dutch barriers, pictures are there. The first, after the major flood in 1953, the Dutch built concrete barriers, and they destroyed the ecosystem of their delta. The environmental awakening in the early 1970s impacted the Netherlands too when they were designing their next barrier, their biggest barrier, which is the Eastern Scheldt barrier, and it's designed to close off a massive sea arm that is not too, probably in size difference than what Kate showed. For here, that was redesigned, doubled the cost to allow the gates to remain open all the time, to allow the intertidal flushing, to keep the system healthy, and close during a period of emergency. Those gates close on average twice a year for anywhere between 8 and 24 hours. The rest of the time they're open and the system works as possible. So you have to be able to plan for these things. The gates in Rotterdam, those are open all the time, and they close only in an emergency, and they've been in place since 1997, and they have closed once. People in the Netherlands were saying, wow, what did we get for our money? We spent a whole bunch of euros on that, and it's not being used. But it was closed in 2005 and 2007. I'm looking at my friend Jos here. It's closed once, and people said, you know what? It worked. And let me put it very bluntly. Hurricane Isaac spun around New Orleans to the northwest of New Orleans for, I think, 40 hours or 36 hours this past August. After Katrina, they built a robust storm surge barrier in a controversial place, an ecosystem, but they built it. We can all question the design of it. The cost of it from design to engineering doubled. So it went from an $800 million project to almost a $2 billion project. The Corps of Engineers and the contractors did a fantastic job. And people in New Orleans will tell you today that $2 billion was well spent because they probably forewent $3 to $5 billion in the structure's second year of life. And this is a 7-year structure, so it paid for itself. And then I'll make one comment, I'll show up. We met with some folks from the Army Corps of Engineers yesterday, and they are terrified. They are terrified of the exposed coastline that New Jersey and Long Island has right now. If a storm, we were there, if a storm would come next year that would have any decent size of surge associated with it, the devastation will be much more. So focusing on the long term is crucial, and doing this well is so important. But there's a risk right now, and you shouldn't forget that too.
We've sort of addressed some of the questions that have been coming from the audience in other questions. There are a few very specific ones I just would like to read from the cards that I've been getting. What implications for brownfield development and cleanup is embedded in creating land sponges? Do we need to change cleanup thresholds and strategies? I think, Kate, this is for you.
Well, I think one thing that we had studied in the Gowanus was that, in fact, contaminated or areas are, the effects of that are just simply exacerbated, and that happened in Red Hook as well. You had hydrocarbons, petroleums that were in fact dispersed throughout the urban landscape as part of the flooding act. So I think that that cleanup, and I think we're talking about multi-tiered response here, and cleaning up the post-industrial legacy of contaminants is a big part of moving towards the future, and not only focusing on the post-industrial waterfront, but the sort of the contamination legacy is going to be critical. I also wanted to just add to your previous question about are we somehow missing something big, and I think the words adaptation and resilience have been used, and I feel like they're used as also a way of course we have to sort of continue moving forward, but I think that somehow there needs to be a little bit more of a paradigm shift in the thinking, again, relative to the way that we plan our communities and our settlement in the United States, which is moving towards one which is less carbon intensive, because I still feel like moving forward, if we're just building higher and higher dikes, it won't really work.
The last thing before we end, Jean, I just wanted to ask you, this comes from somebody in the audience. You answered a question before about what we've been doing recently along the waterfront. Of course, there are many waterfront projects that are still under development, some that are under construction, others that are in the planning stage, some that are more projected. And they tend to reinforce a kind of hardscape edge to the city. Are those things that we really, at this point, should be putting the brakes on and looking at from scratch?
Well, there are legal issues that one would have to address, obviously, but anything that's under review, obviously now, needs to be reviewed with an eye to what we know we need to be doing, which is thinking about how to address the hardscape problem. We have spent a lot of our time in urban design classes in our universities and urban design exercises in our communities, and we have not inserted this piece that we need to insert, which is understanding how to make public access there, but make it access that's going to last for a while and not be swept away in the next storm surge.
So is there anything specific that you want to point to that we should be taking another good look at right now?
Well, just look at the surfaces, look at the materials we're using, look at how we do berms, not do berms, look at our drainage. An example might be if you look at the City Clean Waters Plan in Philadelphia, which has gotten many prizes. It's actually looking at the water system, but the point is that they've integrated into this plan an enormous number of things that will deal with water in a natural sort of way. And so I think we have lots to learn from our Dutch friends, from other cities. New York always likes to say we're the best. Well, we're not. And I think we need to think about it.
So to push this one step farther and play devil's advocate, obviously the biggest of the waterfront or near waterfront development projects that we've got underway right now is Hudson Yards. There was an article in the paper pointing to flooding issues around Penn Station. Much of that is elevated beyond what would have been impacted by Sandy, but we are talking about building that out to the waterfront, given a plan. Should we slow that down? Obviously, much of that is well past the approval stage at this point.
Well, if I were Jane Frost, I'd be taking a deep breath and I'd be hiring up Shaun to think about this.
I think he already did that. All right, well, I think that brings us to our break. Thank you very much to all the panelists.
Said their break, but because we're a little over on time, we're actually, thank you very much to the panel, we're actually not going to do the break. But of course, look, are people desperate for, there was no coffee this morning, so no one should need to use the restroom. Okay, quick stretch, quick BlackBerry, let's say 5 minutes and then we'll be back. Thank you. Great, thank you. Okay,